Yeah, so I think that the question of class is a really central one for socialists, and it's one that is really contested because the way that class is talked about in the media, in general discussions, the discussions you might have at college and so on, is very much a kind of descriptive, surface level understanding of class. So it focuses on what accent you have, what newspaper you read, whether you go to the opera or the football, or and all of these kind of things. I think that for Marxists, the question of class is something that's quite different. Marx himself, when he's developing the set of ideas that we're kind of, talking about today, one of his most important claims was the idea that the working class has the power to change the world, that collectively it's the agency for a massive transformation of society. So Marx wasn't the first socialist. There were people before Marx who talked about wanting a society that was fair and equal and just, and in which people weren't exploited and oppressed. But before Marx, people looked down at, socialists tend to look down on the working class, which was a new group of people in society working in the factories, etc., and kind of, talk about them as, okay, these are the rabble, and we, the enlightened few, have to try and change the world and help them to come out of their ignorance and, and all the rest of it. Actually, what Marx understood was the importance of workers' kind of unique collective nature as a class in society, in capitalist society, and how that was actually the key to transforming society. So he looked at workers in capitalism not as important because they're the most oppressed or the most, or the poorest group of people in society necessarily, but because of this collective power they have that comes out of his understanding of how capitalism works as a system. So capitalism functions through exploitation. Capitalists can't survive without making profits. They can't make profits without bringing workers together in workplaces, in cities, in bigger and bigger groups, really, and exploiting them in order to extract profit from workers' labour. Also, that exploitation that's at the heart of how the system works, necessarily leads to antagonism. It leads to discontent. People aren't really happy about this situation that they find themselves. It leads to resistance among workers. So Marx talks about capitalism creating its own gravedigger in the working class. So he means, he's creating a group of people that it is bringing together into workplaces under similar conditions, with similar interests, collective interests, against them, the bosses, and it's educating them, giving them all kinds of skills of how to produce things in society, etc., etc. It's creating a force which potentially could dig a grave, for that capitalist class. So that's really the very heart of Marxism, but it's it's an idea that's really contested, and it's particularly contested these days. People who are on the left and want to see a transformation of society will think that the way capitalism has developed, particular changes in terms of, say, neoliberalism, globalisation and so on, new technologies, etc., have somehow fundamentally changed this relationship. So even if Marx was right in the 19th century, it's not true anymore that the working class is the force for change. I just want to say, I'm going to come on to exactly what we mean by class and trying to give a definition of how we understand it. But I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about exactly, who's who in our society. What does a ruling class person look like? What does a middle class person look like, etc. Because for us, I think, as socialists, as people who want to see a revolutionary transformation of society, actually it is the working class that's the most important, and obviously there's the enemy, the people who own and control the means of production at the top of society. It doesn't mean there's not all kinds of other people in between, but actually what Marx identified is that's the key divide. The divide that keeps the system going, the divide that is fundamental to capitalism existing as a system, is that divide, that exploitation between the minority who own and control the means of producing things in our society and the majority of people who they exploit. So all kinds of ideas, recently. You think about Paul Mason, a very good journalist he's written a book recently called Post-Capitalism, where he says, all kinds of things have changed. Technology, social media, the way that globalization means that companies move around the globe and so on. So for him now, he says the agent of change has become almost anyone, because we can all connect, via WhatsApp or whatever all around the world, and so that changes the dynamics. Before that, there was ideas around a notion of the multitude rather than the working class or the proletariat in Marxist terms, that there's a multitude, and that includes all kinds of people who might be part of social movements, all the oppressed, people living in the global south, people who are oppressed for their gender or their sexuality and so on, people who have been part of movements on the streets like Occupy, etc. And the working class where it still exists. So all of these people together are the agency for change in society. And I think, that you can find lots and lots of similar kinds of ideas. And I think it's common sense for lots of people now that, yes, workers might still exist, but they don't have the kind of power they used to have. Now, it's absolutely true that the industrial working class has shrunk in the West. Of course, it's grown elsewhere in the world, in China and so on. But firstly, I think it's important to say that smaller numbers doesn't necessarily mean less power. If you look at an economy like Britain, if you look at the car industry, for example, car production in Britain, in 2009, car production was only very slightly lower than it was in 1972, which was the peak of car production in Britain. There's far, far, far fewer car workers now than there were 45 years ago. But actually they can produce pretty much the same number of cars because they've become much more productive. The technology allows a smaller number of workers to produce the same number of cars as much more workers in a previous generation. If you look at that in terms of profits being made in the system, then that means that a smaller number of workers potentially are creating just as much profit for the system as a much bigger number of workers previously did. That gives you more power, if you like. Each of those workers individually, or those workers as a group in our society, actually have more power than they previously did compared to their numbers. It's also the case, though, that often these kind of people who are looking at seeing the working class as less powerful often are only looking at industrial workers, which is obviously the group of workers that has shrunk in countries like Britain. When Marx talked about workers and production and in society and exploitation, he never defined it as just manufacturing workers. Of course, anyone who's trying to study the economy has to look at how it exists in reality at that time. So Marx, of course, was looking at societies like Britain and Germany in the mid-19th century, which were rapidly industrialising. There's particular kinds of heavy industries and coal, etc., involved in that. Of course, the economy looks different today, but there's also all kinds of other jobs. When Marx talked about the working class, he never meant only people who wear overalls to work. He meant everyone who's involved in production of all the things we need in society, and also the things that aren't actually about producing objects, but are about allowing the system to function, so transport networks, communications, and all of these things. I think it's really important that we understand class in that kind of broader way and don't think in terms of this mythical traditional working class, which is normally a white man who does a manual job and is a member of a union, let's say, but actually understand, capitalism as a total system and all the things that it needs to function. So like I say, the common explanation of class at the moment is very much about lifestyle, about how you dress, how you speak, and all of those things. I've got friends who are convinced that they're middle class because they drink wine at home. They might be middle class, but it's not because they do or don't drink wine instead of having beer or whatever it is. For us, those are not the things that are important. We look at class in terms of your relationship, really, to how things are produced in society and to other people with similar interests in your society. So the fundamental divide in a capitalist system is between those who control the means of production and those who have to work for them to make a living. That's the broadest sense, and that's the vast majority of us. Let's say 75% of the population is in that kind of position, not self-employed, not owning means of production or controlling them, but actually having to go to work to labour. Now, it's not quite that simple, because of course there are people who are effectively paid a wage or paid a salary, whose job it is to make the system run effectively for the capitalists on their behalf, so managers, top managers, let's say, not probably the person who sits in the office with you and has to organise, 5 or 6 people, but the kind of people who are very well paid, who are not actually doing work in the workplace, but whose job is to make workers work, to push the exploitation that's taking place in that workplace. But the fundamental divide, like I say, is between the vast majority of people who earn a wage and the minority who own and control the means to produce things in society. Now, among workers, people who are wage earners and who are not, the kind of managers who are doing the capitalist job for them, actually there's all kinds of differences, of course. There's all kinds of different conditions. Some people will be on secure contracts and have quite decent wages. Other people will be, scrabbling from one part-time job to another, maybe working 3 different jobs with no security, 0-hours contracts, and so on. That means that those people have a different experience, inside of the system, but it doesn't mean that they don't have an objective common interest against the bosses. I think the way that Tony Cliff used to put it, he's the guy who founded the SWP, we're all sitting on the same bus, but some of us have got a window seat. So, of course we can't pretend that everyone has exactly the same experience, but we can say, if you step back and look objectively at your relationship to the means of production in society and your relationship to the people around you and to the people above you, then actually you can understand that your common interests are there, with other workers. And this is one of the things that the bosses and the Tories in particular always try and use to divide workers, actually, isn't it? Or, the golden kind of baby boomers with their gold-plated pensions and their secure jobs, like they're to blame for young people not having a pension in the future. They're really just trying to divide different sectors of people who have essentially the same interests. Now, I think in terms of trying to give a definition, obviously I'm talking about Marx and his understanding of class, but there's not like one particular paragraph in Marx that you can go to say this is Marx's definition of class. Actually, his understanding of class feeds through all the work that he does when he's studying how capitalism works and studying how to change it. But there's not a clear definition. One very good definition, though, comes from a Marxist historian called Geoffrey de St. Croix, and he wrote about ancient Greece, actually. He wrote a book called Class Struggle in the Ancient Greek World. And he describes... Class Struggle in the Ancient Greek World is the name of the book. And so I'm just going to quote you his definition of class. He says, class, essentially a relationship, is the collective social expression of the fact of exploitation, the way in which exploitation is embodied in a social structure. By exploitation, I mean the appropriation of part of the product of the labour of others. In a commodity-producing society like ours, this is the appropriation of what Marx called surplus value. A particular class is a group of persons in a community identified by their position in the whole system of social production, defined above all according to their relationship in terms of the degree of ownership or control to the conditions of production. And the conditions of production are the means and labour of production. So the things you use to produce and the ways in which human beings use those things, the ways in which people work. And he says the individuals constituting a given class may or may not be wholly or partly conscious of their own identity and common interests as a class. They may or may not feel antagonism towards members of other classes as such. So for Marxists, class isn't a kind of subjective feeling. I feel like I'm working class Alan Sugar feels like he's working class because he's got an East End accent, you know, or whatever it is. I feel like I'm middle class because I've recently started going to the opera. You know, does that change my class position? No, no, it doesn't. Actually, for us, our starting point is class as an objective set of relationships in society. And again, that thing is important. It's a set of relationships. It's not an identity. So it's not like putting a label on every one of us saying worker, petit bourgeois, you know, bourgeoisie, etc. People's class position can change from under them. You know, if you like, you think about the junior doctors, a layer in society who very much would have been considered part of the middle classes, not part of the working class, not in an antagonistic relationship with the ruling class in society, but somewhere in between, and you know, relatively privileged, coming from relatively privileged backgrounds, etc., etc. Actually, their relationship to exploitation in society has changed, even without their job title changing, because of the privatisation of the NHS, the way that their conditions are being attacked, etc., etc., etc. Their relationship, actually, as a group, with the way that capitalism is currently functioning in Britain has changed. You know, they're kind of being pulled into the working class and actually finding themselves at the forefront of it in terms of that other element, not the objective one, but the subjective one of collective struggle, you know, and antagonism, and actually starting to feel that antagonism towards members of other classes as such, as de Saint-Croix put it. So I think the important thing I'm trying to say there is, you know, in that quote, he talks about the conditions of production, the means and labour. That's what, in general Marxist terms, is generally referred to as the forces of production in society. You know, the tools we have, the raw materials, and the ways in which we produce stuff. But the conditions of production, that's not the same as, you know, the means and the labour, the forces of production, the ways in which we do things, are not the same as the kind of the human relationships inside of that process. The forces of production change all the time. You know, if you think about computerisation, think about the way that industrial production constantly is shifting and learning and coming up with new processes, chucking out old ones. You know, the car industry, like I talked about, becomes massively more productive, efficient because of new technologies and so on. Those things change, and I think, you know, the people I talked about at the beginning, the Paul Masons and others who look to seeing the working class as less powerful now, they're actually looking at changes in the forces of production. They're looking at changes in the way that we produce things, rather than understanding that the fundamental relationship of how we, you know, how the human beings involved in that process do things hasn't really changed. You know, that basic exploitation is still very much there. So I think capitalism has always changed, you know. That's the whole point about it, isn't it? It's a dynamic system. It's a system that's based on competition. Each capitalist, each unit of capitalism is constantly trying to get one up on the other, trying to find a better way, a quicker way of doing it, a cheaper way of doing it, and so on. That means things will always be changing in terms of the forces of production. But inside of that, the relations, you know, aren't necessarily tied to that in the same way. So I think that when theorists or activists today look at the way that capitalism is restructured, you know, over the last 30 years, deindustrialisation, globalisation, etc., if they think that this means the working class no longer has the power it used to have, then I think they're making an error. You know, they're often looking for a working class that looks the same as it used to look 40 years ago or 100 years ago, and you're not going to find that. But also often their idea of what the working class used to look like isn't very realistic either, because there's never been a white working class in Britain, for example. There's always been migrant workers in this country. There's always been women part of the workforce. You know, it's never been true that there's this mythical white male worker that represents somehow what it means to be working class. Working class organisation came about really through unorganised workers fighting collectively to win better conditions and wages and so on. So the other thing that people talk about these days, you know, that trade union organisation is much weaker than it used to be, that it's really difficult to organise people who are on 0 hours contracts, etc., etc. All of these things are true. It is difficult to organise people, but it's not true that it hasn't been done before. There were no such things as contracts, good contracts for workers in the first place. They've always had to be fought for. And this subjective factor is really important, and you find it if you go back to the beginning of the working class movement in Britain. You think about the dockers in London in the 1880s, or the match girls, the match women strike in the same decade. You think about workers in other parts of the world, in Russia in 1905, in the massive factories that existed there. These are unorganised workers becoming organised, through the needs of being collectively exploited, and how that brings people into a situation of having common interests. And you can see the same kinds of things happening today, on a smaller scale with the fast food workers, where they're starting to get organised in the GNB, where you've seen electricians on building sites coming out on marches and strikes and trying to get themselves organised and so on. So I think now we're talking about two things, aren't we? We're talking about the objective kind of class relations that are tried to describe, particularly in that quote. But also, if you go back to what I said at the beginning about Marx, when he talked about why the working class is crucial, it's not just because of the fact that they produce the wealth in society, it's also because they're the gravediggers, because they are forced into this antagonistic relationship with the bosses. So class struggle is built into capitalism. It doesn't mean it always happens, it doesn't mean that workers always feel I'm a worker and I've got, interests opposite to my boss and I'm going to fight him. But actually it does mean that there's a tendency towards workers coming to that realisation, because that's the reality of their experience at some point or another. So when Marx talked about the gravediggers, he was looking at the simple fact, which is often forgotten, I think, that workers are conscious human beings and they will contest the terms of their exploitation. Even if they're not rejecting the whole concept of exploitation yet, they'll fight over the conditions in which capitalism is trying to exploit them. And this is clear to bosses, I think. There's the famous quote from Henry Ford of Ford Motors, who said, why is it every time I hire a worker I get a human being attached? Hire a pair of hands. That's what he wanted. He wanted a pair of hands to help him make these cars. Help him, I say, sorry, to make the cars while he sat in his office counting his money. But every time he tried to do that, he'd get a human being, a conscious human being, who was not happy to just simply accept the conditions he tried to impose. So in capitalism, formally, in theory, we're free. We enter into a contract with our employers. This is kind of the great bourgeois myth, if you like. I'm free to leave this job and go and find another job. I'm free to starve in between if I, if I don't live in a country with a welfare state, etc. But the reality of it, again, we can see in the junior doctors' strike, where they rejected the contract and it was imposed by the government. Now, of course, we're seeing them now organising to reject it again, and let's hope that they're able to push back against it. The reality is we're not free. Workers are not free under capitalism. You may not be tied to one particular boss in the way that some feudal agricultural labourers were tied to a particular bit of land and weren't allowed to move, or the way that slaves were owned. But actually we don't have freedom in reality, because you can't feed yourself without money coming in. I think the final thing, I guess, is that it's really interesting to note that at the moment in Britain, the workers who are at the forefront of the struggle over the last few years have all been, or largely been, public sector workers, white-collar workers, as they tend to be called, not manual, not people who are producing things on a production line, but people who are very, very important to the running of a modern capitalist society, because capitalism now can't function without huge bureaucracies, without huge transport networks, without a health system that enables workers to go back to work every day and not collapse from illness and so on, and without an education system that gets people to a stage where they're able to do meet the requirements of advanced capitalism. So at the forefront of our workers' movement at the moment are all kinds of workers who weren't traditionally thought of as the working class. You know, nurses, the midwives who went on strike last year had never been on strike before in the whole history of the profession. This is really important because it shows us, I think, that fundamental exploitation that goes on at the heart of the system is still there. It's very much alive. In fact, it's you know, expanding, if you like. It's pulling in more and more people into that relationship. And, you know, a lot of those people being pulled into that are recognising it, and they are coming to the same conclusions as workers have done for the last 150 years, which is that you need to be collectively organised in order to take on your bosses, and if your boss is the government, even more so. You know, you need to get people alongside you, and you need solidarity from other groups of workers. So I think that when people talk in terms of social movements being the agent for change rather than the working class, I think the problem is, you know, I think social movements are fantastically important, and they can feed into workplace struggle. They can give people confidence, people who've learned how to fight on the streets, you know, in terms of the anti-war movement or fighting racism, can take those lessons into their workplace, and it can help them build a union. But actually there's no road to socialism that doesn't centrally involve workers collectively organised at the heart of it, because, and this is what Rosa Luxemburg said, you know, that it's where the change of capitalism are forged that they'll be broken. And that's still true today. And I don't just mean, you know, she's putting it very much in early 20th century terminology of forging iron works and all the rest of it. We might need to find a new metaphor for that need. But actually, she's right, you know, and capitalism is still being forged, and it's being forged still in manufacturing, you know, even here in Britain, but also it's being forged, you know, being kept alive by the bureaucracies, the transport workers, the postal workers, the call centre workers, and all those other groups of people who we need to be organising now. So I think that central relationship is the one that we have to keep recognising and keep, you know, flagging up to other people. Actually, you're part of our side as well, and you need collective organisation, and we're going to bring you solidarity.